to say asante, which means thank you in Swahili, because the experience that I had just a few minutes ago, the experience of walking through the pathway of history, of being able to sense the power that was here in 1955, when history was made, when Indonesia was the center of the world and had curated a conference that was earth-shattering, one that would change the direction of international relations for time immemorial, time infinitum. It was such an act of courage, such an act of vision. And I think the delegation that I am with today from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kenya and from the University of Nairobi and others who have joined us sensed that power, were enthused by it. I felt light on my feet. I felt suddenly revolutionary in my thinking. I felt that yes, there still is a place for Asia and Africa to partner in ways that surprise the world, in ways that change the course of international relations. What I propose to do in the next few minutes, I hope I'll only speak for about half an hour, is simply to have a conversation with you. I do have a speech to read. I will deviate from it from time to time because my heart is full. What do you say? The cup runneth over with the emotion of this moment. Imagine that I am standing here where President Sukarno stood in this room, at this podium, addressing heads of state from a variety of nations, seeking a new vision for humanity. I just wonder what that felt like. I wondered how moving that experience was. And I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to stand here on the shoulders of great men and to speak to you today, many, many years after that event, as a woman from Africa who benefited from that engagement. Without 1955, we would not have been assured of Kenya's independence. Without Kenya's independence, the inclusion of women would not have been possible. Without the inclusion of women, I would not be the Minister of Foreign Affairs today, standing here speaking to you. So those are the connections, that's the power of that engagement. So I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the Vice Chancellor of this university and the faculty members for extending this invitation to me to join you here today. This thing is strangling me. Maybe I'll put it that way. To join you here today and to share thoughts and reflections on strengthening the Kenya-Indonesia strategic cooperation. As you all know, yesterday we were privileged to be able to establish a mission for Kenya in Jakarta, Indonesia. It was an important day for us because it crystallized a very long relationship that has existed between Kenya and Indonesia, not just through our bilateral cooperation, not just through important multilateral events like the 1955 conference, but also through a history that we often ignore. We often ignore that Indonesians and Africans are not strangers to each other, and that there is historical evidence that dates back to the 15th, 16th century that tells us that Indonesia, tradesmen and sailors were already traversing the coast of Eastern Africa. They were sailing down from places like Jakarta all the way to the Cape of Good Hope. We know that Indonesians migrated to Madagascar and infused Madagascar with their culture, with their language, with their cuisine, and invigorated Indian Ocean trade networks. Now, those interactions tell us that the 1955 conference was not a mistake. It was a continuation of this relationship between Indonesia and Africa. It also tells us that our desire to collaborate, to deepen our relations with Indonesia by establishing a mission in Jakarta is not a mistake. It's a continuation of an interaction. It's a continuation of a collaboration. It's a continuation of a partnership that is natural. Africa and Asia are natural partners. The unnatural partners are partners with the Europeans and the Northerners. We in the South have always been partners. We have always engaged, and we have done so naturally. We wish to thank Indonesia for taking the helm at a time when the world needed leadership, and for bringing together a host of nations to the historic Bandung Conference of 1955. And I was reading the citations and the excerpts of some of the speeches as I walked through the exhibition. And what struck me were two things that were said, I believe, one by Nehru, who said that Asia and Africa at that time were the center of the world. And then I think President Sukarno was able to himself express the very essence of the conference. It was a rejection of colonialism, and a rejection of oppression, a rejection of racism, and a desire for a peace that was based on justice, on fairness, and on inclusion. That historical moment needs to be revived in our world today. We need to recapture that pride, that spirit of liberty, that spirit of emancipation, that idea that the South can cooperate, that idea that self-reliance, self-determination is a thing of pride. It's a right, and it's one that we need to learn to articulate to deal with the challenges of our time. We need to renew the spirit to tackle the challenges of our time. Now, Indonesia led these conversations at the time of the Cold War. It was able to awaken a spirit of courage amongst many nations. Since then, much has happened. The non-alignment movement evolved from that courage. The G77 evolved from that courage. But after the dissipation of the Cold War, the world has changed markedly. We have been confronted by the unipolar moment of the 90s and the rolling out of the liberal democracy project. We have been confronted by the aftermath of 9/11. We have recently been confronted by the horrors of COVID-19. Now, the things that happened between the fall of the Berlin Wall and COVID-19 were not an inflection point for the world. I think COVID-19 is an inflection point for the world. And it is telling us this, that the status quo is no longer sufficient, and that new partnerships, new alliances need to be crafted to enable us to deal with the challenges of globalization, the challenges of exclusion, the challenges of racism, the challenges of underdevelopment, the challenges of peace and security. That is why I am so grateful that we were able to come and establish our mission in Indonesia yesterday, at a time when Indonesia holds the presidency of the G20. Indonesia is again at the center of the world. Indonesia is again in a place where it can roll out a diplomacy that is innovative, that surprises, a diplomacy that helps the South wake up again and understand its potential and its ability to influence the path of world events. We are glad that at the time we are opening our embassy, Kenya is also a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So both Indonesia and Kenya sit in positions where they are able to influence issues pertaining to peace, issues pertaining to development, issues pertaining to the reframing of our world. Because the world needs to build back better. Is that not what we are being told? We need to revive, we need to be rejuvenated, we need a renaissance, a change, a movement away from the usual to the unusual. Indonesia is a great partner for us because it plays such an important role in the Indo-Pacific region. And we all know that the Indo-Pacific region is that region that is rising and is increasingly becoming the engine of growth and innovation in our world. This is a region where there's an openness to globalization. We see institutional developments. We see a human dynamism that we don't see anywhere else in the world. We see a region where people are fearless, where people look at challenges not with a view to running away from them, but with a view to surmounting them. I have been so impressed by the road network that I was able to drive through today. In Kenya, we are celebrating our first expressway running through the city of Nairobi. Between Jakarta and here, I think I saw about 20 of them. It shows you that you have been pioneering change and development for many years. Your exhibition today told us that your literacy rate is 99.7% for a country with 200 million people. What a feat is that? Your statistic tells us that the majority of your people have access to clean water. 200 million people with access to clean water. It tells us something about what we need to learn from countries such as Indonesia. And that is the ability to establish states that are competent states that have capacity to deliver public goods. You know, for a long time, we have been told that the quality of a state is only that it's able to hold regular elections and that it is able to have certain institutions. We say that there is an underpinning for that. There's an underpinning to the rule of law. There's an underpinning to democracy, and that is state competency. And that's what we learn from the Asian experience. This ability for the state to mobilize, this ability for the state to keep its eyes on ordinary people, to uplift lives, to turn things around. And you know, a competent state, a strong state is not an authoritarian state. It's a state that is capable. And I'm glad that we are coming to partner with Indonesia at a time when our own country is looking to show up its own capabilities to reform the national public health sector, to move towards universal health care, to look at issues pertaining to food security, to affordable housing, to universal education, these things that uplift the dignity of people. And that is the Asian experience, that if you want to transform, you must uplift the dignity of people. And the dignity of people means that people must live better than animals. They must live in a clean environment. They must have access to education. They must have access to opportunities. They must have skills. They must have talent, because these are the things that build nations. These are the things that are the hallmarks of the strength of a people and the strength of a state. So, in joining you here in Jakarta, in planting our mission here, it is our hope that we will be able to establish the partnerships that enable us to deliver the public goods. And I think this MOU that we signed, that brings us together in the field of education, in research, in capacity building, in knowledge sharing, that's the way forward. That's what we need. And we need to learn from experiences of countries that have walked our path, that have themselves been colonized and fought and gained independence, that have had to struggle through the challenge of development and are still struggling through it, but are doing so with so much faith, so much hope. We learn from countries like Indonesia how to deal with diversity, how to bring people together around national values, and to ensure that it is the values that drive the people forward, that change countries, that plant seeds that can be irrigated by the youth of our countries. We thank you for those lessons, and therefore our partnerships are going to be around knowledge sharing. They're going to be about technological transfer. They're going to be about people-to-people contact. They're going to be about sharing the hearts and the minds of our people. Indonesia is also a country that hosts the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and will next year hold the president of ASEAN. Kenya holds the presidency of the East Africa Community. We hold the presidency of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. There are linkages that we can make, not only to uplift our own countries, but to uplift our regions. I hope that in the future, we will be able to form linkages between ASEAN and the East Africa community, that Kenya itself will one day perhaps have observer status in ASEAN. But we know that the spirit of 1955 can be replicated in the economic sphere, that Africa and Asia can come together and build strong partnerships around trade, around enterprise, around endeavor. As we speak, we are beginning to establish the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And we know that here in the Indo-Pacific, you've also established a regional comprehensive economic partnership. These are the bridges towards development, the bridges towards prosperity, that both Kenya and Indonesia must be able to market, must be able to articulate, must be able to bring to their salient place, as we understand that it is cooperation in the South that will transform our people, transform our vision of the world. And I think as we speak, I want to congratulate both Kenya and Indonesia for being able to increase our trade, even in the throes of COVID-19, even with the challenges of supply chain hiccups, supply chain bottlenecks. We were still able to show up trade, which means that these things are possible. These things are possible at the bilateral level, at the regional level, and at the international level. You know, for Africa and for countries like Kenya to transform, we need to participate further in world trade. At the moment, Africa only contributes 3% of world trade. It is only when we engage and bring our business people together, bring our young entrepreneurs together, that we'll be able to break that kind of history. We need to liberate ourselves from this idea that Africa will always be on the periphery of world trade. We want to do what Asia has done and bring Africa to the center of global trade. And this will mean that Africa needs to industrialize, Africa needs to value add, Africa needs to digitize, Africa needs to shore up the skills of its people. And all these ideas are plain for us to see in a country like Indonesia. So the question is, what are the strategic partnerships that we can engage in that go beyond just bilateral engagement, but also speak to the fact that both Kenya and Indonesia are in places of influence and can look different, can help others look differently at the world in which we live. I think the first thing that we must do, of course, is to strengthen our bilateral ties. And I'm glad that we have opened an embassy. And it is my hope that the discussions that we had with the Minister of Foreign Affairs yesterday and with the Vice President of Indonesia will come to see the light of day, and that we will cooperate in the areas of education, in the areas of trade, in the areas of ICT, in the areas of fisheries, in opening up our blue economies, in the area of defense and security, in establishing good contacts in the areas of infrastructure and healthcare and so on. We need to be strategic. We need to measure the quality of our engagements and ensure that we deliver value at the earliest possible opportunity. It is not enough to sign MOUs. It is not enough to sign agreements. What is on paper must be seen practically. They must be a manifestation for Kenyans and Indonesians to see that indeed we do have a bilateral relationship that is strong. What can we do on the world stage? I think there is time for the spirit of 1955 to rise again. First, we must look at the multilateral system again with new eyes, having regard to the lessons that we have learned from COVID-19, the lessons of exclusion, the lessons of vaccine apartheid, the lessons of countries being left behind. We must ask ourselves what needs to be different. For us in the South, we feel that we need South-South cooperation to facilitate the reform of the United Nations Security Council. This is something that has been on the table for many years, and I think it's time that we uplifted our voices to ensure that there is inclusion, to ensure that peace and security is a collaborative experience, and that the decisions that come out of the United Nations Security Council are actually those that will extend the peace, that will sustain the peace. I think we also need to look at other international institutions, the WHO, the WTO, and ask ourselves whether these institutions are fit for purpose. In Kenya, we are committed to the idea that we need a pandemic treaty, so that in the event of another pandemic, there is a rule-based order for dealing with pandemics. We are convinced that we must look at the TRIPS regime under the WTO and ask ourselves whether it is acceptable for patents not to be shared in the middle of a pandemic. We must continue to ask ourselves about how debt is managed and whether the regimes of the IMF and the World Bank are sufficient for the needs of our continent today. We need to stir up the hornet's nest so that we can ask these questions and perhaps find solutions. I think we can also work together to build a new impetus around development. We need to ask ourselves whether the development tools that have been made available to the world are sufficient, whether they are fighting poverty in places like Kenya, in places like Africa. And what do we learn from the Indonesian experience, from the Asian experience, that will help us tweak these development paradigms and change them so that they meet the needs of our people? I'm very, very concerned about the global health security structure. We need to ask whether it is sufficient to deal with pandemics, whether it's sufficient to deal with the scarcity of medicines, the inequalities, the forgotten diseases. How do we build strong health systems in Asia and in Africa that will turn our economies around and that will help our people live in dignity and in hope? Finally, I think that we need to work on this idea of state competency. During our time at the United Nations Security Council, we have spoken a lot about the idea of the power of the state as a positive instrument in our societies. And there's a lot to learn from our experiences. There's a lot for us to share so that we're able to begin to look at the interventions we need to strengthen our states so that we become self-reliant, so that we become proud of our actions, and so that we are able to build trust between our populations and our state apparatus. There can no longer be this separation between the state and the people. We need to find ways to close those links and to create countries that are strong in nationhood and strong in states that are capable. Finally, I'd like us to work together around issues pertaining to climate change. Climate change has been on the table now for a number of years. And the challenge for those of us in the South is this, that we are the least polluters, but we are being asked to bear the greatest burden. We're being asked to reshape our development path. We're being asked not to use this type of energy, but to use that type of energy. We're being asked to enter into a space of a green transition. I think that we need to raise our voices in the South around the idea of emphasis being placed on adaptation and funds being provided for adaptation, because that is where we are. We need to adapt to climate change so that we do not break the backs of our nations and so that we build resilience in our communities. 2, we need to make the green transition work for us. The green transition cannot be a pathway for, again, strengthening the North and weakening the South. We must ensure that the technologies that are produced, the jobs that are produced in the South, so that the South is strengthened through the green transition and not excluded. Finally, we need to tell our stories. And the stories that we heard today as we walked through this beautiful museum were the stories of power. And every young Asian, every young Kenyan, every young African needs to hear that story. I hope all Indonesian children come to this museum and they walk the street that President Sukarno walked with President Nasser and the rest of them. It is my hope that because we have started this relationship with this university, with the establishment of a mission in Indonesia, that many Kenyan students will come here and walk this path, sit in these seats, and understand what it means when the power of the South comes together, confronts challenges, and surmounts them. I want to thank you for bringing us here to this place, for allowing us to sit where great men sat, for allowing us to speak where great men spoke, for allowing us to speak about their ideals again, because the ideals are still fresh. They have not grown stale. They have not putrefied. Instead, they have been refreshed. Every time someone walks through this museum, those ideals are refreshed. They are made anew. They blossom again. And I hope that the young people who accompanied me here today from the Kenya Embassy will take something away from here. Be fearless, but be fearless based on values. Be courageous, but be courageous based on ideals. Be strong because you're Africans. Be strong because you're Asians. And understand that you too have a place in this world, and that you too can change that world for the better. I am delighted that we have begun our journey here in Indonesia today based on the values of 1955, based on the values of non-alignment. And may we rise and seize the day. Let us not be afraid to engage for change. I thank you.